So, what happens when you call up the listing agent and they say the seller is agreeing to pay the buyer's broker X amount of dollars? What form do I use? How do I deal with this? Well, if you just follow the bouncing ball here, this is our handy dandy guide for our practice changes. We've got our buyer broker agreement signed. We have an agreement for it. You've called them. The seller is down here. The seller has decided to pay the buyer's broker. What you're going to use is you're going to use the FAR, all right, the FAR compensation agreement, seller to buyer's broker agreement. Now, remember, these agreements, it's extremely important to understand this. These agreements are between the seller and the buyer's broker. And the other agreement is between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker. So these agreements, they're not amongst the seller and the buyer. They're amongst either the listing broker and the buyer's broker, or they're amongst the seller and the buyer's broker. So they're separate contracts. So when you're dealing with a listing, when you have a buyer and you're working with the listing agent, remember there's three contracts at play. There's the listing agreement, which is the agreement between the seller and the listing office. There's the buyer broker agreement, which is the agreement between Domain Realty and your buyer. And now there's going to be a third contract, which is going to be, in this case, the seller to buyer's broker. And the reason why I make this so clear, crystal clear, is because it doesn't matter, all right, if you're using a NABOR buyer broker agreement, if you're using a FAR buyer broker agreement, if you're using a NABOR contract for sale, if you're using a FAR contract for sale, if you're using a FAR listing agreement, a NABOR listing agreement, because these agreements, this compensation agreement is between the seller and the buyer's broker, all right? That's why it doesn't matter. So if you have a NABOR buyer broker agreement, you can use this compensation agreement, all right? There's nothing on here. There's no language that's in here, all right, which is in conflict with really anything else, because it's literally an agreement between the seller, I'm going to use my little handy dandy thing here, between the seller to the buyer's broker, so that the person who's selling their home, all right, is going to sign down here. And look, the seller is he's going to sign this, all right? If it's a husband and wife, he'll sign here, she'll sign here. And then the buyer's broker, which is going to be us, Domain Realty. So that agreement is between the seller and Domain Realty. So understand that you have to understand, kind of put on your thinking caps and really kind of put that and drill that in to into your noggin. Why is it that we're using these agreements, and it's okay to look at them in terms of, like, mixing and matching. Obviously, it's not a good policy. Now, when you have a sale, if you actually have when you're buying something, okay. Now, all the amendments and everything like that go with those particular set of contracts, those are they work in concert with each other, but not these compensation agreements. These are new, all right? These are new agreements, and so, but in any case, so that's when you're going to want to use that. The seller to buyer's broker, and again, it's got the same thing. The buyer's broker's Domain, the seller is whomever that owns the property that your buyer is trying to buy, the property address, the seller's broker is right down here, and you're going to want to put whatever it is that they're offering. If they're offering, 3 points or something like that, go ahead and put that in there, and make sure that everybody signs off accordingly. So that is the document that you need to use if the seller is agreeing to pay the buyer's broker directly.